After Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy faced the cameras and spoke a sentence that sounded almost impossible. He wondered if some awful curse really did hang over the Kennedys. For most families, that would sound dramatic. For the Kennedys, it sounded like a question the whole country was already asking. A brother killed in war. A sister damaged by a medical procedure that should never have happened. A president murdered in public. A senator murdered 5 years later. A young woman dead in a submerged car. And decades later, the president's son gone from the sky over the Atlantic. This is the story of the Kennedy curse, but not as a ghost story, not as proof of the supernatural. This is the darker question. What happens when one family is raised to believe greatness is not optional? And what does that pressure cost? The Kennedy story begins with power. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was rich, ambitious, and obsessed with legacy. He wanted his children to win, to lead, and to carry the family name into history. The Kennedys were not just expected to succeed, they were expected to dominate. In public, they became symbols of beauty, wealth, Catholic pride, and American confidence. But behind the photographs, something colder was taking shape. The first major blow came during World War II. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was the eldest son. He was the one originally imagined as the future president, the golden heir. In 1944, he volunteered for a dangerous mission connected to an experimental bombing program. His aircraft exploded before reaching its target. Joe Jr. was dead at 29. The family dream did not die with him. It moved. The burden shifted to his younger brother, John. John F. Kennedy had health problems, chronic pain, and a complicated private life. But after Joe Jr.'s death, the path that had been meant for the eldest son now pointed at him. The family machine turned, and JFK became the new face of destiny. But another Kennedy tragedy had already happened, one kept far more hidden. Rosemary Kennedy, the eldest Kennedy daughter, had intellectual and emotional difficulties by the standards of the time. Her behavior worried her father. Her future, in a family obsessed with image, became a source of fear. In 1941, Rosemary underwent a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time, the procedure was still being promoted by some doctors as a treatment for psychiatric and behavioral conditions. But in Rosemary's case, the result was catastrophic. She was left permanently disabled, with serious impairments in speech and movement. For much of her life, she lived away from the public eye. This was not supernatural. It was a human decision, made in a specific medical and social world. A world where disability was hidden, where family image mattered, where control could be mistaken for care. Rosemary's story is one of the most painful parts of the Kennedy legacy because it reveals something beneath the glamour. The name had to be protected, even from the truth. Then came the 1960s, the decade when the Kennedy family reached its peak, and the decade when the curse became part of American mythology. John F. Kennedy became president in 1961. He was young, charismatic, and surrounded by images that felt almost cinematic. Jackie Kennedy, the children, the White House, the promise of a new era. Then, on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, the president was assassinated. The murder was public. It was filmed. It was replayed. It entered the national memory like a wound that never fully closed. Officially, Lee Harvey Oswald was accused of killing Kennedy. But Oswald himself was killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. That sequence created a space where suspicion could live forever. Facts, questions, theories, and grief all collided. For millions of people, JFK's death was not just a murder. It felt like something had broken in the American story. Then Robert F. Kennedy stepped forward. He had been Attorney General under his brother. After JFK's death, he became a senator and eventually a presidential candidate. To many Americans, Robert seemed to carry the unfinished promise of his brother. In 1968, he won the California Democratic primary. Moments later, in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he was shot. Robert Kennedy died the next day. Another Kennedy brother. Another public assassination. Another national trauma. At this point, the idea of a curse no longer sounded like a fringe superstition. It became a way of describing the emotional pattern. The Kennedys seemed too powerful to be ordinary and too damaged to be lucky. But the next tragedy was different. It did not happen on a battlefield. It did not happen in a hotel kitchen. It happened on a small island road in Massachusetts. On July 18, 1969, Senator Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. The car sank into the water. Inside was Mary Jo Kopechne, a 28-year-old political campaign worker. She died. Ted Kennedy survived. The details of that night became one of the most controversial episodes in modern American political history. Kennedy did not immediately report the accident to police. He later pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. For some, Chappaquiddick was the moment the Kennedy myth changed. Before, the family had been seen mainly as victims of tragedy. Now, a tragedy was connected to questions of responsibility, privilege, and power. And when Ted spoke afterward of an awful curse hanging over the Kennedys, the words carried a strange weight. Was he describing fate? Or was he describing the consequences of a life lived under impossible expectations? That is where the legend becomes complicated. Because a curse is simple. A curse says tragedy comes from outside, from fate, from God, from some dark force following the bloodline. But the Kennedy story is not simple. It is a story of war, politics, fame, risk, secrecy, addiction, mental health, recklessness, and the pressure to never appear weak. The family continued into later generations, and the tragedies continued too. David Kennedy, one of Robert Kennedy's sons, died of a drug overdose in 1984. Michael Kennedy, another of Robert's sons, died in a skiing accident in 1997. These losses did not have the same national shock as the assassinations, but they deepened the pattern. Another young Kennedy, another sudden death, another headline linking the family name to disaster. Then came 1999. John F. Kennedy Jr. was not a politician, but he carried a political myth from birth. As a small child, he had saluted his father's coffin. That image became one of the most haunting moments of the 20th century. To the public, JFK Jr. was more than a person. He was living memory, the son of Camelot, the child who survived the assassination story. On July 16, 1999, he piloted a small plane from New Jersey toward Martha's Vineyard. His wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren Bessette, were on board. The plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. All three died. Investigators later pointed to pilot error, with spatial disorientation as a major factor. Night flying over water can be dangerously deceptive. Without clear visual references, a pilot can lose the ability to tell whether the aircraft is climbing, descending, or turning. Again, no supernatural force is needed. But that did not stop the word from returning: curse. Because by then, the public had learned to read every Kennedy tragedy as part of one long shadow. In later years, the pattern seemed to continue. Saoirse Kennedy Hill died in 2019 from an accidental overdose. Maeve Kennedy McKean and her young son Gideon died in 2020 in a canoeing accident. Each event had its own facts, its own causes, its own grief. But the family name made them feel connected. That is the strange power of the Kennedy curse. It may not explain what happened, but it explains how people feel when they look at the whole story. Human beings search for patterns. When tragedy happens once, we call it misfortune. When it happens again, we call it coincidence. When it happens across generations, especially to a family that seems larger than life, we reach for myth. The Kennedys were never just private citizens, they were symbols. And symbols do not suffer privately. Their grief becomes public property. Their mistakes become national arguments. Their deaths become chapters in a legend. Some versions of the Kennedy curse story even mention supernatural claims, including tales of an old curse placed on the family. But those stories should not be treated as verified history. They belong to folklore, not evidence. The real mystery is not whether a hidden spell followed the Kennedys. The real mystery is why the idea of a curse feels so convincing. Maybe because the contrast is so extreme. The Kennedys had money, beauty, access, education, and influence. They had everything people are told to want, and still, they could not outrun death, shame, illness, addiction, or loss. That contradiction unsettles us. It makes the world feel less fair. If even the most powerful family in America could be shattered again and again, what protection does anyone really have? There is another possibility. Maybe the Kennedy curse is not a curse at all. Maybe it is the burden of the name. A family raised to be fearless may take greater risks. A family trained to win may hide weakness. A family watched by the world may turn private pain into silence. And silence can be dangerous. It can hide illness. It can hide trauma. It can hide the moment when someone needs help. The Kennedy name opened doors, but it also created a standard that no human being could live up to forever. To be a Kennedy was to inherit opportunity, but also expectation. To inherit history, but also ghosts. In the end, the Kennedy curse may be less about fate than pressure. Less about darkness from outside the family, and more about the darkness that grows when greatness becomes a demand. Joe Jr. died trying to prove courage in war. Rosemary was damaged in a world that feared imperfection. John and Robert were killed in the violent center of American politics. Ted survived Chappaquiddick, but never escaped its shadow. JFK Jr. lived as a symbol, then died in a moment of human error over black water. These were different tragedies, different causes, different lives, but the name tied them together, and that is why the legend survives. Not because it proves a curse, but because it feels like one. A dynasty built to conquer history became haunted by it. And behind every photograph of Kennedy glamour, there is another image waiting in the dark. A plane falling, a car underwater, a hotel kitchen, a motorcade in Dallas, a child saluting a coffin.